I thought the police would protect me. That was my first mistake. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed softly, flickering just enough to make everything feel slightly unreal, like I had stepped into a place that existed outside normal life. The kind of place where truth was supposed to matter, where saying the right thing would make you safe, where people like me could walk in shaking and walk out protected, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling as I sat in that hard plastic chair, fingers wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold, my reflection faintly visible in the dark window across the room, pale, wide-eyed, barely recognizing the girl staring back at me, because an hour ago I had been someone else, someone who believed the world still made sense, someone who thought doing the right thing came with a reward. But then I saw it. Not clearly, not like in movies, just flashes, a dark street, voices raised too low to understand, the sharp tension in the air that made my chest tighten before anything even happened. And then, the silence that followed, heavy and absolute, the kind of silence that tells you something has changed and can't be undone. And I ran. I didn't think. I didn't stop. I just ran until the glowing red and blue sign of the precinct came into view like a lifeline, like something solid in a world that suddenly felt unstable. And I told myself over and over, this is where you go. This is what you do. Good people go to the police. Good people tell the truth. So I pushed through the glass doors, breath uneven, heart pounding so hard it made it difficult to speak. And when the officer at the desk looked up, calm, almost bored, I felt this fragile sense of relief, like maybe I had made it in time, like maybe everything would be okay. I told him I needed to report something, my voice barely steady, and he gestured for me to sit, to start from the beginning, and I did. I told him everything I could remember. Every detail that replayed in my mind whether I wanted it to or not, the sound of footsteps, the shape of a car parked too close to the curb, the way one of the men turned his head just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face. And even as I spoke, I could feel the weight of it settling around me, like each word was pulling me deeper into something I didn't understand. But I kept going because stopping felt worse, because silence felt dangerous, because I thought if I just got it all out, if I just told the truth, someone would take control and fix it. And the officer nodded as he wrote, his pen moving steadily across the page, asking a few questions, nothing unusual, nothing that made me think anything was wrong, until the door behind him opened, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet shift in the air that made the room feel smaller, colder, like something unseen had just stepped in. And before I even turned, before I even knew why my breath caught in my throat, I felt it. That same tension from earlier, that same instinct telling me that whatever safety I thought I had found was about to disappear. The air changed before anyone spoke, like the room itself knew who had just walked in, and my body reacted before my mind could catch up, my grip tightening around the paper cup until the thin rim bent under my fingers, the officer in front of me pausing mid-sentence, his pen hovering just above the page as if whatever I had been saying no longer mattered. And I followed his gaze without meaning to, turning slowly in my chair until I saw them. 3 men at first, all in dark suits that looked too sharp for a place like this, too precise, too intentional, like they did not belong in a building that smelled faintly of old coffee and paperwork. And then the man behind them stepped forward, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving with a kind of quiet certainty that made everything else feel like background noise. And I knew before anyone said anything, before my brain could form a rational thought, that this was the same presence I had felt earlier, the same invisible pressure that had wrapped around my chest on that street, the same instinct that had told me to run. Except now there was nowhere to run, not here, not with fluorescent lights and uniformed officers, and a door that suddenly felt very far away. And when his eyes lifted and found mine, everything inside me went still, not fear exactly, something deeper, something colder, like recognition without understanding, like my body had already decided this moment mattered more than anything that had come before it. He did not look surprised, not even curious, just focused, like he had been expecting to find me here. And that realization settled into my chest with a weight that made it hard to breathe. The officer cleared his throat softly, shifting in his seat, his posture changing in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, straighter, more careful, like he was suddenly aware of being watched, of needing to be precise. And he stood up, not quickly, not nervously, but with a kind of respect that I did not understand. Not until he spoke, not until he said a single word that made my stomach drop, "Sir," and I blinked, because that was not how this was supposed to go. This was a police station. This was where authority already existed, where uniforms meant control, where people like me came for help. But the word hung in the air anyway, shifting the balance of the room in a way I could feel in my bones. And the man stepped closer, close enough now that I could see the details I had missed from across the room. The clean lines of his suit, the faint shadow along his jaw, the stillness in his expression that did not read as calm, but as control, the kind of control that did not need to announce itself. And he stopped just a few feet away from me, not invading my space, not touching me, but close enough that I could feel the presence of him, like standing near something powerful and not knowing if it would move. The officer beside me shifted again, glancing between us, and for a brief moment I thought he might say something, might explain, might reestablish whatever normal rules were supposed to exist here, but he stayed silent, and that silence said more than anything else could have, because it told me that whatever I thought this place was, whatever safety I had imagined when I walked through those doors, it was not real, not in the way I needed it to be. And the man finally spoke, his voice low, even, controlled, the kind of voice that did not need to be loud to be heard. And he said my name, not questioning, not guessing, just stating it. Emily Carter, and the sound of it coming from him sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room, because I had not told him my name, not out loud, not yet, and my mind raced, trying to catch up, trying to find some explanation that made sense, some reason why this stranger would know who I was, but nothing came. Only that same heavy realization settling deeper, that I had stepped into something I did not understand, something bigger than a report or a statement or a single night on a dark street. And his eyes did not leave mine as he continued. "You said you saw something tonight." And the way he said it made it sound less like a question and more like a fact, like he already knew the answer, like everything I had tried to do, every word I had spoken in this room, had already reached him before I even realized it could. And in that moment, sitting under flickering lights, with a cold cup of coffee in my hands and a police officer standing quietly beside me, I understood something that changed everything. I was not here to give a statement. I was here because I had already been found. My name sounded different in his voice, like it belonged to him now, like it had already been filed somewhere I could not see. And I felt something shift inside me, a quiet, creeping understanding that I had lost control of this situation long before I ever walked into this building. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out at first, just a shallow breath that did nothing to steady me. Because the way he was looking at me made it impossible to pretend this was normal, impossible to pretend I was just another person filing a report. And the officer beside me finally moved, clearing his throat again as if remembering his role, gesturing toward the chair across from me. "Sir, we were just taking her statement," his voice careful now, measured in a way that made every word feel deliberate, and the man did not even glance at him, his attention still locked on me, as if the rest of the room had faded away entirely, as if there was only me and whatever I had just stepped into. And then he did something that made my pulse spike for a completely different reason. He pulled out the chair and sat down across from me, not beside me, not standing over me, but directly in front of me like this was a conversation he had every intention of finishing, and the distance between us suddenly felt too small, too personal. I could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the stillness in his expression that never quite softened, and I realized with a jolt that he was not trying to intimidate me, not overtly. He did not need to. The control was already there, woven into the way everyone else in the room adjusted around him. The way the officer remained standing now, silent, waiting, and that silence pressed against my ears until it became unbearable. I forced myself to speak. I told the officer what I saw, I said, my voice quieter than I intended, but steady enough to carry, and for the first time, something flickered in his gaze, not surprise, not anger, something sharper, more focused, like I had just confirmed a detail he had already suspected, and he leaned back slightly in his chair, studying me in a way that made me feel exposed without him ever asking another question. "You came here alone," he said, not as a question, and I nodded before I could stop myself, because lying felt impossible under that kind of attention, because every instinct told me he would know. and he exhaled. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if something had just aligned in his mind. And then he shifted his gaze, not to the officer, but past him, toward the front desk where another uniformed man stood pretending not to listen. And in that single glance something passed between them, something unspoken but understood, and I felt it like a current in the room, like invisible lines connecting people in ways I could not map. And suddenly the walls of the precinct felt thinner, less solid, like they were only a surface covering something much deeper, much more complicated. I thought I was supposed to be safe here, I said before I could stop myself, the words slipping out, fragile and uncertain, and that was the first time his expression changed in a way I could read, not softer, not kind, but something close to understanding, something that almost resembled regret, and he leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, lowering his voice just enough that it felt like it was meant only for me. You came to the right place, he said, but there was a pause, a fraction of a second that stretched longer than it should have, and in that pause I felt the weight of everything unsaid, everything I did not know, everything I was about to learn. And then he finished, just not for the reason you think, and my stomach dropped, because I understood then that whatever I had witnessed tonight was not the real danger, not the full story, it was only the beginning, and the realization settled over me like a shadow, cold and unavoidable, as the man in front of me, the one every officer in this building seemed to defer to without question, reached out slowly and turned the paper in front of the officer toward himself, scanning the notes that had been written about me, about what I saw, as if my story already belonged to him, as if it always had, and I sat there, hands still wrapped around that cold paper cup, realizing that walking into this place had not saved me, it had delivered me exactly where I was never supposed to be. The paper should have felt like proof, like something solid I could hold on to, but as he read it, line by line, it started to feel like evidence against me instead, like every word I had spoken was being weighed for something I did not understand, and I could not look away from him, from the way his eyes moved across the page with quiet precision, not rushed, not careless, but deliberate, like each detail mattered more than I realized. And the longer the silence stretched, the louder everything else became. The hum of the lights, the distant ringing of a phone somewhere behind the front desk, the soft shuffle of footsteps that never quite came closer, as if the entire building had decided to keep its distance from whatever was happening at this table. And I swallowed, forcing myself to speak again, because doing nothing felt worse than saying the wrong thing. I did not mean to see any of it, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I was just passing through. I was not supposed to be there. And he did not look up immediately, did not interrupt, just finished reading the last line before setting the paper down with careful precision, aligning it neatly with the edge of the desk like even that small detail mattered. And then he finally met my eyes again. And there was something different there now, something more certain, as if whatever doubt might have existed was gone. You were not supposed to be there, he repeated quietly, not mocking, not questioning, just stating it back to me in a way that made it sound like part of a much larger equation. And I nodded quickly, relief flickering for a second because maybe he understood, maybe this was still something I could explain my way out of. I did not see everything, I added, the words coming faster now, trying to regain control. I only saw enough to know something was wrong. And that was when his expression shifted again, not softer, but sharper, like I had just confirmed something important without realizing it. Enough is always the problem, he said, and the way he said it made my chest tighten, because it sounded less like a warning and more like a fact, and he leaned back slightly, his gaze flicking briefly toward the officer who was still standing beside us, silent, waiting, and then back to me. You described a car, he continued, calm, steady, a dark sedan parked too close to the curb, and I froze, because I had said that. I remembered saying it, but hearing it repeated back to me in his voice made it feel different, heavier, like it meant more than I had intended, and he watched my reaction carefully, not missing a single shift in my expression. You described a man turning his head, just enough for you to see his face, and I could feel my pulse in my throat now, each beat louder than the last, because I knew exactly what he was referring to, that brief moment, that single glance that had stuck with me long enough to bring me here. And I nodded again, slower this time, unsure now, uncertain of what I was confirming, and the room felt smaller, tighter, like the walls had moved in without me noticing. And then he said something that made everything tilt. "That man is not who you think he is." And I blinked, confusion cutting through the fear for a moment, because I did not think anything. Not really. I had just seen something that felt wrong and reacted the only way I knew how. "I do not know who he is," I said, more honestly than anything else I had said since sitting down. And for the first time, something almost like approval flickered in his eyes, as if that answer mattered, as if honesty, in this moment, was the only thing keeping me from stepping further into something worse. "Exactly," he said, and that single word carried more weight than I expected, because it was not agreement, it was confirmation. And he leaned forward again, closing the distance just slightly, enough to make his presence feel unavoidable. "What you saw tonight was not meant to be seen," he continued, his voice lower now, controlled, measured in a way that made every word feel intentional. And the implications settled over me slowly, like something sinking beneath the surface. Not meant to be seen meant not meant to be reported, not meant to be explained, not meant to be understood by someone like me. And I felt that fragile sense of certainty I had been holding on to finally start to crack. Because if that was true, then coming here had not been the solution. It had been a mistake, and he seemed to read that realization on my face, because his expression shifted just enough to acknowledge it. "You thought this place would protect you," he said, and there was no judgment in his tone, just quiet certainty. And I nodded again, because denying it felt pointless now, because that belief had already been broken the moment he walked in. And he held my gaze for a long second before speaking again, slower this time, as if choosing each word carefully. "This place is already part of what you walked into." And the meaning of that settled into my chest like a weight I could not lift, because it meant there was no clear line between safe and dangerous, no simple answer, no obvious way out, only a reality I had stepped into without understanding the cost. And as I sat there, under flickering lights with officers who no longer felt like authority and a man in front of me who clearly was, I realized something I could not ignore anymore. I had not just reported what I saw, I had become part of it. The words should have reassured me, should have clarified something, but instead they made everything heavier, like I had just been handed a truth I did not know how to carry. And I sat there trying to process it, trying to find some way to push back against it, because accepting it meant admitting that I had nowhere left to turn, nowhere left to go. And my fingers tightened again around the paper cup, the thin cardboard creasing under the pressure as I forced myself to speak. "Then why am I still here?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Because if this place was not safe, if it was already part of whatever I had stumbled into, then sitting here made no sense, staying made no sense. And for the first time since he sat down, something close to a choice entered the room, a shift so subtle I almost missed it, because he did not answer immediately. He just watched me, measuring something, weighing something, as if the next words mattered more than anything he had said so far. And that silence stretched long enough for doubt to creep in, long enough for me to wonder if I had asked the wrong question. But then he leaned back slightly, his gaze flicking briefly toward the officer again before returning to me. "Because you walked in before anyone else could reach you," he said, and the meaning of that settled slowly, like a delayed realization catching up to me. Anyone else, not the police, not him, someone else entirely. And a chill ran down my spine, because that meant there were more pieces to this than I had seen, more people involved than I had understood. And I shook my head slightly, trying to make sense of it. "I do not understand," I admitted, because pretending I did felt pointless now, because every answer only seemed to open another question. And something in his expression shifted again, not impatience, not frustration, just a quiet acknowledgement, as if confusion was expected, as if it was part of the process I had unknowingly stepped into. "You were seen," he said simply, and those 3 words landed harder than anything else, because they stripped everything down to its core. It was not about what I had reported, not about what I had said. It was about the fact that I had been there at all, that someone had noticed, that my presence had already changed something I could not undo. And I felt my breath catch, the weight of that realization pressing down on me. "So coming here made it worse," I said, the words barely leaving my lips, and he tilted his head slightly, considering that, not dismissing it, not fully agreeing either. "Changed the timing," he corrected, "and that was somehow worse. because it meant this was not a mistake in the way I had thought. It was a shift, a variable in something already in motion, and I could feel the edges of panic starting to creep in again, slow and insistent, because I did not like not understanding. I did not like being part of something without knowing the rules, and I leaned forward slightly, matching his posture without realizing it, trying to find some kind of control in the conversation. "What happens now?" I asked, and this time there was no hesitation, no pause, just a steady, immediate answer that made my stomach drop. "Now you leave with me." And for a second I thought I had misheard him, because the words did not fit, they did not align with anything I expected. "Leave with you," I repeated, disbelief creeping into my voice despite everything I had just learned, and he held my gaze without flinching, without softening, as if the statement required no explanation, as if it was the only logical outcome. And I glanced instinctively toward the officer, waiting for some kind of reaction, some kind of interruption, something that would re-establish the boundaries I had grown up believing in. But the officer did not move, did not speak, did not object. He simply stood there, silent. And that silence confirmed everything I needed to know, because it told me this was not a request, not a suggestion. It was already decided, and my heart started to race again. Faster now, louder, because leaving with him meant stepping fully into whatever this was, meant giving up whatever illusion of control I had left, but staying here, staying in a place that no longer felt safe, no longer felt neutral, felt just as impossible. And he seemed to read that hesitation on my face, because his voice softened just slightly, not in kindness, but in clarity. "You can stay," he said, and for a brief moment hope flickered, fragile and desperate. But then he finished, "And wait for the people who already know your face." And that hope disappeared just as quickly as it had come, replaced by something colder, something more certain. Because in that moment I understood that this was not about choosing between safe and dangerous. It was about choosing between unknown danger and known protection. And as I sat there under flickering lights with a decision I had never expected to make, I realized something I could not ignore anymore. Walking into this place had not given me a way out. It had forced me to choose who I would trust with my life. The choice did not feel like a choice at all. It felt like a narrowing path, like the world I thought I understood was quietly closing doors behind me one by one. And I sat there staring at him, trying to find something in his expression that would tell me this was a test, that there was still a right answer that led back to normal. But there was nothing, no hesitation, no doubt, just that same steady certainty that had been there since the moment he walked in, and my mind raced through every possible outcome, every version of what could happen next, staying here, walking out alone, leaving with him. None of them felt safe, none of them felt right, but one of them felt less unknown, and that realization settled into my chest with a strange kind of clarity, because for the first time since this started, I understood what I was really deciding, not where to go, but who already knew more than I did. And I let out a slow breath, my grip on the paper cup loosening as I set it down on the desk, the faint sound it made against the surface louder than it should have been in the quiet room. I looked at the officer, just once, searching for something, anything that might anchor me back to what I used to believe. But he did not meet my eyes, did not offer reassurance, did not even pretend this was still his responsibility. And that was the final piece, the last confirmation I needed. I pushed my chair back slowly, the legs scraping softly against the floor as I stood, my movements careful, deliberate, as if moving too fast might shatter whatever fragile control I had left, and I turned back to him, my voice quieter now, but steady. "I am not doing this because I trust you," I said, the words coming out more honest than I expected. And for a fraction of a second something shifted in his expression, not offense, not amusement, something closer to respect, like honesty was a language he understood. "You are doing this because you understand the situation," he corrected calmly, and I did not argue, because he was right, because trust had nothing to do with it, and everything to do with survival. And he stood then, smooth and unhurried, like the decision had already been made long before I spoke it out loud. The men behind him moving in quiet synchronization, not surrounding me, not touching me, but creating a space that made it clear where I was supposed to go. And I hesitated for just a second, my eyes flicking toward the exit, toward the glass doors that had seemed like safety not long ago, and now felt like a threshold into something I could not define. And he noticed. Of course he noticed, because nothing about him suggested he missed anything. And his voice came again, low and steady. "You can still walk out alone," he said. And the words hung there, heavy with implication. But we both knew what that meant. We both knew what waited outside that door. And I swallowed, forcing my feet to move. One step, then another, following the direction that had already been set. And as I passed the officer, I felt something shift again, something final, like crossing an invisible line that I could not step back over. And the room behind me seemed to fade, the sounds dulling, the lights dimming in my memory even as I moved forward. And when we reached the door, he stepped slightly ahead of me, pushing it open with a simple motion. That felt more significant than it should have, because it was not just a door, it was an exit from one version of my life into something else entirely. And the cool night air hit my skin as I stepped outside, sharper than I expected, grounding and disorienting at the same time. The city stretched out in front of me, familiar and unchanged, and yet completely different now, because I was seeing it through a lens I had not chosen. And I paused on the sidewalk, my breath catching for just a moment as I took it in. The distant hum of traffic, the glow of streetlights reflecting off damp pavement, everything exactly as it had been before, and nothing the same. And he stopped beside me, not rushing me, not pushing me forward, just waiting, as if giving me a moment to understand what I had already stepped into. And then he spoke again, quieter this time, almost like a reminder rather than a command. "From this point on, you stay close." And I turned my head slightly to look at him, because there was something different in the way he said it. Not just control, not just authority, something else layered beneath it, something that sounded almost like a promise. And I realized then that this was not just about leaving the station. This was about entering a world where the rules were already written, where my choices were already limited, and where the man standing next to me was no longer just a stranger, but the only reason I was still standing here at all. The street should have felt like freedom, like stepping outside meant leaving everything behind, but instead it felt like standing on the edge of something I could not see, something that had already started moving long before I realized I was part of it. And I stayed still for a second longer than I should have, my eyes scanning the sidewalk, the passing cars, the people across the street who had no idea how different the world had just become for me. And that contrast hit harder than anything else, because everything looked normal, everything sounded the same, and yet I knew with absolute certainty that nothing about my situation was normal anymore. And I became aware of him again beside me, not crowding me, not touching me, but close enough that I could feel the shift in attention as people passed by. The subtle way some glanced, and then looked away quickly, like they recognized something I did not fully understand yet. And then I saw the car, parked at the curb just a few feet ahead, dark, sleek, out of place in a way that made it stand out without trying. And one of the men moved ahead of us, opening the rear door with quiet efficiency. No words, no gestures beyond what was necessary, and I hesitated again, not because I thought I could still turn back, but because stepping into that car felt like crossing another line, one that would be even harder to return from. And he noticed. Of course he did, because he noticed everything. And his voice came again, calm, steady, cutting through the noise of the city without needing to rise above it. "Hesitation will not change the outcome," he said, and I let out a slow breath, nodding slightly more to myself than to him. Because I knew that already, because every step since walking into that station had been leading here whether I wanted it to or not. And I moved, sliding into the back seat, the leather cool beneath my hands, the door closing softly behind me with a finality that settled deep in my chest. And a second later he followed, the space shifting instantly with his presence, not smaller, not tighter, just different, like the air itself adjusted around him, and the door shut, sealing us inside from the rest of the world. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the city lights passing outside the window in blurred streaks as the car pulled away from the curb, smooth and controlled, and I focused on my breathing, on the steady rhythm of movement, trying to anchor myself to something that made sense. But my thoughts kept circling back to the same question, the same realization that refused to settle, and I turned slightly toward him, unable to stay silent any longer. "Who were they?" I asked, my voice quieter now, but steadier than before, because if I was already part of this, I needed to understand at least a piece of it. and he did not answer immediately. His gaze fixed forward as if considering how much to say, how much I was ready to hear, and then he shifted his attention to me, just enough for me to feel it without fully meeting my eyes. "They are not mine," he said, and that single sentence changed everything again, because until that moment I had assumed, even without realizing it, that whatever I saw belonged to him, that he was the center of it, the source of the danger, but his words pulled that assumption apart, leaving something far more complicated in its place. "Then why do you care?" I asked before I could stop myself, and this time he looked directly at me, his expression unreadable, but his focus absolute. "Because they are moving into territory that does not belong to them," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, not anger, not fear, something closer to calculation, like this was not personal, but it was not insignificant either, and I felt a chill run through me again, because territory, in this context, did not mean streets or neighborhoods the way I had always understood them. It meant something else entirely, something structured and controlled and invisible to people like me. And I leaned back slightly, trying to process that, trying to fit it into a version of reality I could still understand. "So I just got in the middle of something bigger," I said slowly, and he did not correct me this time, did not soften it or reframe it. He simply nodded once, and that confirmation landed heavier than any explanation could have, because it meant there was no simple way out, no easy resolution waiting at the end of this, only a deeper involvement in something I had never meant to touch. And the car continued moving through the city, turning onto a quieter street where the lights were dimmer and the traffic thinner, and I realized with a sudden clarity that I did not know where we were going, not in any practical sense, not in any meaningful way, and that uncertainty settled into my chest alongside everything else, and I turned my head toward him again, the question forming before I could stop it. "Where are you taking me?" And this time there was no pause at all, no hesitation, just a calm, direct answer that made my breath catch in a way I could not explain. "Somewhere safe," he said, and for the first time since this started, I did not know whether to believe him, or if believing him was already part of the risk I had no choice but to take. Safe should have meant something. It should have felt like a destination, like a place with clear walls and locked doors and rules that made sense. But as the car moved deeper into quieter streets, past buildings that looked expensive without trying, past windows that reflected nothing but passing light, I realized that safe, in his world, did not mean what it meant in mine. It did not mean protection you could understand. It meant control. It meant distance from whatever was chasing you, even if you did not know exactly what that was. And I leaned my head slightly against the cool glass of the window, watching the city blur past in streaks of gold and shadow, trying to slow my thoughts down enough to catch up with everything that had happened. But every time I thought I understood one piece, another one shifted out of place, and I turned back toward him again, unable to stay quiet any longer. "You said they are not yours," I said, my voice steady but quieter now, like I was still testing how much I was allowed to ask. "So who are they?" And this time he did not look away, did not delay his answer. But there was a slight change in the way he sat, a subtle shift that made me realize this question mattered more than the others. "They are new," he said simply. And that word should not have meant much, but the way he said it made it feel heavy. Like new did not mean unfamiliar. It meant unpredictable. It meant something that had not yet settled into whatever structure existed beneath the surface of this city. And I frowned slightly, trying to make sense of that. New does not sound dangerous, I said before I could stop myself. And something almost like a quiet breath left him. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. Just a small acknowledgement of how little I understood. "New means they do not follow the rules," he corrected, and that landed differently, because rules implied something organized, something that had been there long enough to matter, and I felt a chill run through me again, because I was starting to understand that whatever he was part of, whatever world I had stepped into, it was not chaos, it was structured, controlled, and the real danger came from the people who did not respect that structure, and I sat with that for a moment, letting it settle, letting it reshaped the way I was seeing everything. "So I saw something I was not supposed to see because they broke those rules," I said slowly, and he nodded once. And that simple confirmation felt heavier than anything else, because it meant this was not random. It was not an accident in the way I had thought. It was a collision between systems I did not even know existed. And the car slowed slightly as we turned onto a long quiet drive lined with trees that blocked out most of the city noise, the headlights casting soft shadows that moved with us, and I felt my chest tighten again, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of what I was realizing, because if what he said was true, then this was not over, not even close, and I looked at him again, searching for something I could hold on to, something that felt certain, and I asked the question that had been building since the moment he said safe. What happens if they find me? And this time his answer came without hesitation, without any attempt to soften it or avoid it. They will try, he said, and the calm certainty in his voice made it worse, because it meant this was expected. This was already part of whatever calculation he was making, and I felt my breath catch, my fingers curling slightly against the seat as the reality of that settled in. And he continued before I could respond, but they will not reach you. And there was something in the way he said it, something that cut through the fear just enough to make me pause. Because it was not reassurance in the way I was used to, it was not comforting or gentle, it was absolute, like a fact that did not need to be proven. And I turned my head fully toward him now, studying his profile, the stillness in his posture, the control in every movement. And I realized that this was what safety looked like in his world. Not promises, not guarantees, but certainty backed by something I could not yet see. And the car finally came to a stop, smooth and controlled, the engine idling softly as the gate in front of us began to open without anyone stepping out, without any visible signal. And I felt that same shift again, that same realization that I had crossed another invisible line. Because places like this did not open for people like me, not without a reason, and the gate slid back completely, revealing a driveway that curved out of sight, and he spoke again, quieter this time, almost like a final statement rather than an explanation. From this moment on, you are not alone in this. And I did not know if that was meant to reassure me or remind me, because both felt equally true as the car moved forward and the world I knew disappeared completely behind me. The gate closed behind us with a quiet finality that I felt more than heard, like something unseen had just sealed off the last piece of the world I recognized. And I sat there for a moment as the car rolled forward along the curved driveway, my eyes tracing the outline of the property as it slowly revealed itself, the house emerging from the shadows not in a dramatic way, not like something meant to impress, but in a way that made it clear it did not need to try, large, precise, controlled. Every light placed with intention, every line clean and deliberate. And I realized with a strange sense of clarity that this was not just a place someone lived, it was a place designed to function, to protect, to contain, and the car came to a smooth stop in front of the entrance, the engine idling softly for a second before shutting off completely, and the silence that followed felt different from the silence at the station. This one was not uncertain, it was settled, like everything here already knew its place, and I did not move right away, my hand still resting against the door as I tried to process what stepping out would mean, because each step tonight had carried more weight than the last, each one pulling me further away from the version of my life I had understood, and I could feel that same hesitation rising again, quieter now, but still there, and beside me. He waited, not rushing me, not repeating himself, just allowing the moment to settle, as if he understood that this was not about the door or the house, or even the situation anymore. It was about the realization that there was no clear way back, and I let out a slow breath, before finally pushing the door open, the cool night air brushing against my skin again as I stepped out onto the smooth stone beneath my feet, the faint sound of gravel shifting somewhere in the distance, and I straightened slightly, my eyes lifting to take in the entrance ahead, the tall doors, the soft lighting that cast long shadows across the ground, and for a second I felt small in a way I had not before, not weak, not powerless, just aware of how far outside my normal world I had moved. And he stepped out after me, the door closing behind him with a quiet click, and the space shifted again, not because anything changed physically, but because his presence seemed to define it, like this place belonged to him in a way that went beyond ownership, and I turned slightly toward him, the question forming before I could stop it. Is this where I stay? And he nodded once, simple, direct, yes, and there was no elaboration, no explanation of how long or why or what came next, just that single confirmation that this was now part of my reality, and I hesitated again, not at the threshold this time, but at the idea of accepting that answer without understanding it. But before I could push further, before I could ask another question that I was not sure I was ready to hear the answer to, one of the doors opened from the inside, quiet and precise, revealing a woman standing just beyond the frame, her posture straight, her expression calm in a way that felt practiced, not cold, not unkind, just controlled, like everything else I had seen tonight, and her eyes moved to me, taking in my appearance, my hesitation, the uncertainty I was no longer able to hide. And then she nodded slightly, a small, acknowledging gesture that felt more like recognition than greeting, and stepped aside without a word, and I looked back at him instinctively, searching for some kind of confirmation, some sign that this was still part of the same decision I had already made, and he met my gaze. Steady, unchanging. "You are safe here," he said, and those words should have meant everything. They should have settled something inside me, but instead they raised a different question, one I could not ignore anymore. "Safe from who?" I asked quietly, and for the first time since I had met him, there was a pause, not long, not uncertain, just enough to make me realize that the answer mattered more than anything else he had said tonight. And he stepped slightly closer, not invading my space, but close enough that I could feel the weight of his attention again, close enough that his voice did not need to carry far when he spoke. "From the people who do not follow the rules," he said, and the meaning of that settled into me slowly, like everything else had, not with sudden fear, but with a deep, steady understanding that this was not temporary. This was not something that would end when the sun came up or when I decided I had had enough. This was a shift in the foundation of everything I thought I knew. And I turned my head slightly, looking past him toward the open doorway, toward the space that now represented something I had never expected to need. And I realized then that this was not about escaping what I had seen, it was about surviving what came after. And I stepped forward, crossing the threshold without another word, because there was nothing left to say that would change what had already begun. And as the door closed behind me, soft and final, I understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. I had walked into the police station thinking I was ending a story, but I had only just begun one I could not walk away from.